Hey everyone, Mr. Hallam here, and we are recording chapter 2. So if I haven't had you pause the video, you can pause on the title card now. Let's move on to slide 1. We're going to be talking about personality and the theories of personality. What makes you who you are? And there's a lot of different ways to look at this. We're going to look at what traits kind of make up someone's personality. What is it, though? Is it someone's actions? Is it someone's thoughts and feelings? Is it just the way they present themselves, how they interact with other people, how they are alone? How do we know what someone's personality truly is? And so first we're going to start with the Sigmund Freud line of thinking. And we talked briefly about Sigmund Freud, but his psychodynamic theory was that the subconscious creates personality, that the things underneath, your past, your experiences, and some of the subconscious that you don't know is happening is what creates your personality, that drives you or doesn't drive you or pushes you. And he kind of broke this down into 3 parts. We have the id, which is the subconscious animalistic instincts. That us as humans are animals, and we have these instincts to get our needs met. Food and water and shelter, as well as his big focus was sex and sexual instincts, that we have this animalistic instinct to procreate, to have sex, to gain mates, and that's boiling underneath. On the flip side, we have the superego, which is our morality, our conscience. It says that's not good, that this sexual subconscious drive is not good, that we need to kind of keep it down and use it at appropriate times. And that's kind of our conscience. It says, hey, sometimes our animalistic instincts, the id, says that we should tear someone's face off, and we don't need to do that. So that's a superego. And then in the middle, we have the ego. It's kind of the referee between the two, because we have to find a balance, right? We have to find a balance of instincts, but still have those societal standards being met, and not coming off like a pure animal in society. So that's how Freud kind of broke it down for each person, and it's debated how true this is. But I think this is something that does push people, and we have to know when to use each of these. So I'm going to pause it here. If you need to take down more of the notes, let's move on to slide 2. So Freud basically said that we have defense mechanisms that we use when there are major problems, and that's what we kind of go with. So these defense mechanisms, kind of deny or distort our reality. That these are ways that we deal with trauma that kind of create our personality, and they can be fine. That these can be okay. They become unhealthy when it causes bad behavior, causes bad emotional problems. So first is repression. Repression, we talked about, is something that a lot of people think happens when you have a traumatic event. Usually doesn't, but it can. But if you have a threatening idea or memory, it's kind of forgotten, right? We put that in the subconscious, we kind of put it away. And Freud said, you subconsciously can repress, but you also consciously can repress and suppress material. So today, modern analysts kind of focus on the subconscious repression, but, we can try to kind of block things out. Number 2 is projection. And that's when you put your own behavior on someone else. So when we see this happen often, if you're feeling embarrassed, or something like that, that you might put that on someone else. So an example is if you feel embarrassed about having sexual feelings towards a member of a different ethnic group, you may project that discomfort onto them. You may actually be more racist against a group that you have that sexual attraction to. That happens often. That's projection. So that can happen. We see it with homosexuality often, that people that are heavy anti-gay are gay. That happens very often. That's projection, that you're kind of projecting these thoughts and feelings on a different group and trying to kind of do that own repression in that way. 3 is displacement, and this is when people direct their emotions towards things, animals, inanimate objects. We usually see this a lot with kids, right? They get angry at their parents, and so they beat up a stuffed animal, and that's okay. That could be a healthy way to get rid of that. And so what Freud said is, hey, this can actually be really good with sublimation. And sublimation is turning it into creative pursuits. So that's why we see really good musical artists or singers, songwriters, artists, painters, a lot of times have maybe mental illness, depression, things like that. They use displacement to deal with it. Let's take these negative emotions and let's use it toward art. Let's use it toward a creative craft. Let's use it to write music. And so often that can happen. So that's sublimation, and sometimes why that happens. 4 is the reaction formation. And the reaction formation is when, this kind of subconscious anxiety, transforms itself to the opposite end, right? Transforms itself to the opposite consciousness. So, and this often happens in domestic abuse situations, right? Where you have, if a spouse is afraid of another spouse that abuses them, either it doesn't have to be, it can be physically, it can be emotionally, they're going to kind of cling to the belief that they love them a lot, even though they are abusing them, and that happens a lot. With abuse and manipulation, the reaction formation is a lot of times how people deal with it, and it's really hard to break apart. 5 is regression. This could be when someone regresses back to an earlier psychological state. Once again, we see this a lot with children. If you have an 8-year-old, 10-year-old, their parents get divorced, they have problems, and they may start wetting the bed. They regress back to an earlier state. And adults can do this too, right? Having temper tantrums and going back to kind of childhood ways of when things don't go their way, acting like children. That's regression. And then 6 is denial, just refusing to admit that there's a problem. If someone is a heavy alcoholic and someone say, hey, you should stop drinking. It's really affecting everything. They say, I don't have a problem. It's not a problem. So that is part of that. So I'll pause here if you have to take down more of the notes. We'll continue on. So next, we're going to talk about the psychosexual stages of development. These were Freud's stages of kind of young people, so from birth to puberty, of kind of the stages that people go through that end up, if you have, his thought was, if you have problems in these stages, that they can manifest themselves when you're an adult in different ways. So, if there's conflict, anxiety, those frustrations aren't resolved in these stages, that they can affect you. Once again, today, some of this stuff, we can't prove it that it's false, but it may not be the whole story here. So year 1 is kind of the oral stage. You see babies and children, put their fingers in their mouths. They want to put every toy in their mouth. That's the oral stage. And Freud said, hey, if you have problems during the oral stage, then you probably do things that deal with your mouth, biting your nails, smoking, putting things in your mouth essentially as kind of placeholders, overeating, chewing on pencils. That can be an oral stage thing. Year 2 to 3 is the anal stage, right? It's you're getting potty trained. And so he kind of compared this to like being anal retentive, that, if you have problems, you could be really obsessively neat, or be kind of a hoarder and be excessively messy and disorganized and hoard things and live a dirty lifestyle, if things are really bad. Like, I'm talking extremes on both of those cases. For the anal stage. Year 3 to 6 is the phallic stage, and this is where the Oedipus complex comes into play. If you've never heard of the Oedipus complex, it's based on a story where Oedipus, King Oedipus, didn't know, but he actually killed his father and married his mother, not knowing they were his parents. So Freud said, hey, this is actually something that happens, that in this stage that children will really want to be with the opposite the opposite gender parent, and want to kind of cast aside, the same gender parent. So, a young girl might say, I'm going to marry dad, or a young boy might say, I'm going to marry mom when I'm older. That's the Oedipus complex. And he also talked about how there's ways when the phallic stage of children kind of exploring their genitals and compared to their parents, and the differences is when we start to really see that kind of come into play. You can look in the text. I don't want to talk too much about that, but you can look in the text for more on that. Then we go into the latency stage, which is kind of the non-sexual stage in preparation, so kind of pre-puberty, right? And then the genital stage is puberty, puberty hitting in middle school to high school, and that kind of happening before adulthood. So this is, so he's basically saying, hey, these things that happened to you when you were young, some of these repressed things can manifest themselves later in life. I'll stop here if you have to take down more of this, and we'll continue on. Carl Jung was originally a big, Freud kind of supporter, and then he kind of broke off from Freud. They had a lot of fights about different things, but he's in that subconscious category. And what he talked about was more societal and society's ways, this collective unconsciousness that society has these ideas and symbols, and that is a big piece of how we look at people. And he talked about archetypes. Maybe some of you've heard in English class, but archetypes are these almost stereotypes, like the mandala, which is like the hero. So the hero of the story, or the shadow, which is the pure evil of the story, right? And so like these, in The Wizard of Oz, right? You have Dorothy, the mandala. You have the Wicked Witch is the shadow, and these are very pure. We see these two sides, and we try to place people within these. He also talked about the anima and the animus, which is the anima is basically the feminine sides of men, the animus is the masculine sides of females, and kind of pretty revolutionary for the time. When he came up with this in the early 20th century, that femininity and masculinity are on kind of a scale. Men aren't 100% masculine and women aren't 100% feminine, right? You fall on this kind of moving scale, from 1 to 100-ish percentage. And so how much of that is in each person depends on the person, and kind of getting at some ideas that we look at today. Jung also talked about, object relations school, which is like early children, their view of their mother is what he specifically said, but we've kind of seen like parents in general, but project that on all adults, that basically all adults are like your parents, and takes a while to kind of get rid of that. And so what we see is a lot of, what independence versus reliability on others maybe comes from how much your parents interact with you, how much they have you be independent. Sometimes it can work in opposites or in tandem. And so this is kind of Carl Jung stuff. Now, Carl Jung would end up having a pretty bad psychotic break, and actually was a huge Nazi supporter. And so a lot of what he's written, we've kind of cast aside because of that. But, there are some ideas here. So there's some problems with the psychodynamic theory with Freud and Jung. Basically, first and foremost, that it can't be disproven. And I may have mentioned this last chapter, but it's called the principle of falsifiability, right? Like, if you can't disprove something, does it make it real? If I said, hey, Mr. Murphy is a space alien, you can't prove me wrong, so it must be true, right? And that's psychodynamic theory. Well, it's the subconscious, so you can't prove it wrong, so it must be true. We must go through these stages. Like, hey, you like to bite your nails. You must have had a problem in your oral stage. Can you prove me wrong? You can't, so it must be true. That's a problem. That's a big issue in psychology in general that we have to keep an eye on. The other things is that this kind of draws from these, the experience of just a couple patients. They were very case study centric, and that's a problem. That's not reliable. Those aren't reliable results. We have small sample sizes. What about all the other things? What if you have a single parent, single father? Does object relations school apply? So there's a lot of questions of what's applicable here. But at the same time, some of this does make a lot of sense when we look at kids and what happens to them and their development. All right, let's move on to the next slide with personality today. So what do we do? How do we monitor personality today? There's a lot of different ways to do it. The Myers-Briggs test might be one that you run into. We may even take it in here, even though it's not very reliable. But this is a test commonly used in the business world and in school and universities. I took one going to be a teacher. They're like, hey, you should be this kind of personality, which I was not to be a teacher. But, that's kind of the common thing, but it doesn't really take into much example. So what we've really found in psychology with study is 5 big factors of personality. One, which is in the Myers-Briggs, is extroversion versus introversion, needing people to recharge versus alone time to recharge, is kind of that difference. 2 is neuroticism versus emotional stability. And this is kind of, what do you tend to be, a positive emotion person, negative emotion person? What do you kind of focus on within this? So, neurotic individuals could be warriors, complainers, defeatists. Even when they have no major problem, you're kind of down on yourself. That could be kind of one side to feel that anger, guilt, contempt, that kind of thing. Number 3 is agreeableness versus antagonism. This kind of reflects that do we want to have friendly relationships, or do we want to have hostile ones? Are you good-natured, or are you irritable? Do you like to be a little combative, or do you really just try to make everyone happy? Number 4, conscientiousness versus impulsiveness is kind of responsibility and dependability. Are you kind of dependable and steadfast? Are you kind of fickle? Are you impulsive or really disciplined? That's what that is. And 5, openness to experience versus resistance. You're imaginative, curious, you want new experiences. You're uncomfortable with change on the other side, and you kind of want that routine. So those are kind of the 5 big things we found, not only in humans, as I'll talk about later, actually in all animals that are relevant. So I'll pause it here if we need to, and move on to the next slide. So genetic influences is the next piece. So how do our genes play a part? And we've actually found that genetics plays a huge part in personality. And so they have some personality influence, but the benefits species to have various personality types, right? And that's one thing that I think is a key takeaway here is if all humans had one personality type, we wouldn't exist anymore. Look at dogs. Like, you have a pack of dogs. It's good if you have some dogs that are eager, that want to explore, that want to find new places. It's good that you have some dogs staying in the back, taking control of the situation, watching, making sure there's no danger, right? That's good. And so the big 5 traits work over species, races, religions, ethnicities, everything. These 5 traits really work when we've seen it. They did a lot of tests with dogs and asking dog owners to rate their dogs and their personality, and asking, a friend that knows the dog to rate their personality, and someone that just is random and observes the dog. And they almost were all spot on, just looking at this dog, like these personality traits work. So genetics, right? What we found with genetics is that some of the early temperaments in babies can be applied to later personality. If a baby's very fussy and cries a lot, they could be a little more high maintenance, and some of these traits that we can see is a little more aggressiveness and that kind of thing. Whereas if a baby's very lax and doesn't cry that much, and that can be something, if they're exploratory or not. So all these things can play into personality that it actually keeps no matter what happens to them later. And some traits have high heritability, have a lot of genetic influence. Some don't. So like height is an example of a physical trait that is genetically based, right? And we can track your parents' height, and your height, it probably correlates to that. Is it perfect? No, but usually it does. So how do we do this with behavior? And the studies that we used were identical twin studies, because fraternal twins are a little bit different. Their genetic makeup is not necessarily any more similar than other siblings, but identical twins, have that genetic makeup. And what they found was some case studies of identical twins that were separated at birth, that came back together, that had similar mood, similar mannerisms, even similar habits, like to watch TV or drank the same brand of beer, wore the same kind of facial hair, like their haircut the same way, like some really crazy things you wouldn't think have any influence. But you don't want to oversimplify. You don't want to say, oh, well, genetics is in charge of everything. Like if, genetics says you're going to be a murderer, so you're a murderer. It's not like that, but your personality, your attitude can be influenced by it. Let's go on to the next one. So environmental influences, how does the situation around you affect you, is big too. So social cognitive learning theory says that part of our personality is from our surroundings. And, one of these is this kind of reciprocal determinism, that your personality determines situation, which helps mold personality, right? So it kind of goes both ways. Like, by personality, if I'm a very positive person, that maybe that puts me somewhere where I want to be, and that helps me be more positive. So personality can almost push itself and increase. So we study this in siblings, right? Because siblings growing up in the same household, close in age, but have different personalities. Why? It's same genetics, same parents. Even if not all the DNA is the same. And so this is due to non-shared environments, right? Maybe your 4th grade teacher inspired you to really love science. That didn't happen for your sibling. That's a non-shared environment. So if we change any type of environment, it'll change personality a bit. And parental influence on personality is actually limited. we found that parents don't have a major influence on personality, even in a shared environment. If they raise their children the same way, it's not big. And the reasons for this are kind of unknown. It's not that parents can't have an influence, but that usually environment of the home doesn't have much influence. Usually, parents, they change their child rearing style over time. And, even when they try to be consistent, that we haven't found much relation. What we have found is that parents can affect temperament. They can affect discipline. They can affect, kind of hard work and values. So there are a lot of things that parents parents, guardians, people in your life can influence, but it's not necessarily your quote unquote, the big 5 personality traits are pretty well met. And parents they're not going to make you an extrovert when you're an introvert, right? No matter how they raise you, parents aren't going to make you, going to make you more of a, of one of the personalities that you're not, and that's kind of the difference there. So that's what we're talking about with this. Parents can have an influence, but not on that. All right, let's move on to the next slide. And then let's talk about the cultural approach. And so the question is, does your culture, the country you live in, the religion you are, the culture that you are, does that have an influence? And it does. So the question is what is your culture? Is it individualistic? Something like the United States, probably individualistic culture. We value independence. We value freedom. We value, we should be able to do what we want. And collectivist culture is more about collectivism, that we're going to try to help the group. It's more about group harmony. Even if my life is really bad, if it helps the group, then it's worth it. So genetic pieces are used differently in different cultures. What we've seen when we've looked at testosterone, for example, is in cultures of honor, quote unquote. Some of the older middle age type things where a big piece of the culture was about honor. And if you disrespected me, then we have to fight. We saw, 5 times more people died because of duels of honor. And, that testosterone, kind of that id of Freud, right, coming out. So that's an issue. And so different cultural rules have an effect on personality for sure, but you definitely don't want to stereotype people. It's not that anyone who is, from the Middle East has this personality, but being from that area, having that culture, could have an effect on how you view other people, how you interact with other people, what's appropriate and what's not. So that's kind of an issue as well. So that's the cultural approach. Move on to the next slide. So this is Maslow's hierarchy of need. You don't have to write this down, but I do want to talk about it in our last slide for the humanist approach. And Abraham Maslow in the 70s kind of made this from the humanist approach of personality, that we have to meet the bottom to get to the top. So we need our physiological needs. We need air, water, food, shelter, sleep, clothing, etc. We need to make sure we're safe and secure. We want that friendship, that intimacy, kind of the humanist approach. We want those connections. And that in turn will give us, self-esteem and feel respected and feel recognized. And then we can be the best that we can be, self-actualization with that. And so, Maslow's hierarchy of needs is kind of an approach of personality that we're going to try to meet these needs. And that's going to be our big focus. Carl Rogers, who kind of created humanism, he's going to add conditional regards to this, that a lot of times, what we learn as children is our parents, want us to behave well, and we feel like they'll love us if we behave well. And that's not true. That's kind of a conditional positive, right? And that can have a problem there as well. Adults often do that you have to do these things for me to love you, for me to feel connected to you. And so that in turn affects our personality. We try to do things to please people instead of who we actually are and what our personality actually is. That's why when people talk about relationships, you need to be yourself and don't let someone change you, that kind of thing. And it's tricky, right? Because your personality, no, you probably shouldn't have it be changed, but are there actions that you take that could be harmful or toxic in that relationship that you shouldn't? Absolutely. So those things all affect it. And then Rollo May is the existentialist of the group, and very kind of out there, but shows that this balance of free will versus anxiety in trying to find our purpose. So it emphasizes that, hey, when we're trying to find our purpose, we're going to be really anxious and desperate, that life's really hard. And so when we try to find our purpose out there, it's going to take a lot of emotional and psychological turmoil. And so that can affect our personality. So this is kind of an interesting approach. It's a lot about connections and people and experience. A lot of this is untestable. That principle of falsifiability, that we can't prove it wrong, but how much the extent is true. What we probably have figured out is that all these things combined, Freud's theories and the cultural aspects and especially genetics and the humanist approach, all these combine to create our personality, and that's really what happens. So we'll dig more into this as time goes on. I appreciate everyone taking the time to take these notes, and I'll leave this up if anyone else needs it. Thanks so much.